sensible, but if it tickles your fancy, why not? I suppose. Flo's here. You can probably tell with the papers. First off, Flo, a lot of focus in the international media today on Syria, isn't there?
That's right. First of all, on the diplomatic wing of things, the Washington Post focuses on what it called a day of chaotic international diplomacy yesterday. That's after the UN uninvited Iran to attend those crucial peace conference talks in Switzerland, a way of opening the way for the Syria peace talks, according to the Washington Post. Now, The Guardian focuses on how chaotic the situation is on the ground, and on its front page today, it talks about a huge cache of evidence that's been smuggled out of Syria, which, according to The Guardian, shows the systematic killing of about 11,000 detainees. It calls it industrial-scale killing by the regime, and it has actually a link to a report where you can see some photos that were actually documented by the regime. Now, I've decided not to show you these photos because they're incredibly graphic, but you can go on The Guardian's website if you're interested in seeing those photos and a report by several very high-placed lawyers who talk about these photos. Now, according to The Guardian, all this is evidence of murder and torture, and it could lead to war crimes charges for the regime. And it points out that there have already been reports of abuses by the regime and by the rebels, but this is by far the largest scale evidence.
Okay, the latest evidence there on Syria. Moving on, Central African Republic also getting a lot of attention.
That's right. Here in France, first of all, let's take a look at the front page of Le Figaro, which talks about how France is enlisting Europeans in Africa. So Le Figaro explains what's going on. This is European foreign ministers who've decided to send 500 soldiers to the Central African Republic to reinforce the 1,600 French soldiers who are already on the ground. So the French press is pretty happy about this. The Wall Street Journal focuses on the Central African Republic today, and their editorial talks about saving the Central African Republic and says that the world should really care about the fate of the Central African Republic because it could well become the scene of Africa's next Rwanda-style genocide. And it says that Paris and its European partners deserve credit for trying to prevent the worst in the Central African Republic. But first of all, France's patience isn't unlimited, and second of all, the world's attention span is short. The article says that the Central African Republic's greatest tragedy may be that ultimately no one can save the country from itself.
Let's move away from conflict, shall we now? A lot of focus on China in the international press, China and pollution.
That's right. I pulled out an article, first of all, from the South China Morning Post that talks about a UN report that says that the world's richest nations are outsourcing their carbon pollution to China and other rising nations. Basically, the problem stems from things like electronic devices and cheap clothing, all sorts of things that are made in China but consumed in Europe, where there's less pollution. But there's another interesting article, this time on the front page of the International New York Times today, which talks about how outsourcing production to China doesn't actually spare the U.S. from pollution. And you can read the title here, China's output for exports is linked to U.S. smog. So how does this work? Well, it's for the very first time researchers from the National Academy of Science have quantified how air pollution in the U.S. is affected by production in China. Basically, filthy emissions from China float across the Pacific Ocean and pollute the west coast of the United States. This says that it explores what it calls the environmental consequences of interconnected economies.
Got another story from China, haven't you? Guardian. It's about single mothers.
That's right. It's a very interesting article in The Guardian that talks about how single mothers fight prejudice in China. Now, although there's been a dramatic liberalization of sexual attitudes in recent decades in China, this doesn't extend to single mothers. For instance, premarital sex has become somewhat common in China, but unmarried motherhood remains a taboo. Now, technically, an unmarried mother is actually breaking family planning laws and so is fined because of that. Fined and rejected, says The Guardian. They often have a hard time finding jobs, for instance. But the article points out that things are changing. And just to finish up with one more article in China, this time in the Wall Street Journal. It's quite a heartbreaking report on the children of migrant workers. In China, they're known as the left behind children. Now, basically, China has about 250 million migrant workers who pour into cities from rural areas, but they're not allowed to take their children. So about 61 million Chinese children, that's 1 in 5 Chinese children, have not seen their parents in the last 3 months, and basically they're left alone and have to grow up on their own, become adults very quickly. It's a very heart-wrenching story that also could have very important consequences, according to the Wall Street Journal. It quotes some social workers who say this could have very consequences not only for Chinese economy, but it could trigger social unrest. And in the meantime, all these children, according to the article, are missing their parents.
Some fascinating stories, as ever, in the international press, pulled out by Flo here on France 24. Coming up for you next then, the latest news, plus in today's focus, the crisis hitting the crown. I'm talking about the Spanish crown, in fact. A youngest daughter of the king has been indicted, and now polls are suggesting he himself should abdicate, with a special report in the next half hour.